I think saddles are probably the most misunderstood component on a bike.
The human crotch is not designed to bear weight. If you're pedaling hard, you actually don't need as much padding than you do when you're pedaling easy. Physics says every force is an equal and opposite force. So if we're pushing down, there's a reactionary force that's pushing back up.
Sean Madsen, welcome to the Downtime Podcast. How's things with you today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, man. And we're going to talk saddles. I think saddles are probably the most misunderstood component on a bike, and a lot of people suffer unnecessarily as a result of that. So in this conversation, we're going to try and help with that by demystifying a little bit of the science with you as the expert. And by the end of the episode, giving people the info they need to help them find the right saddle for them. Before we do that, though, I want to find out a little bit about you, Sean, because I think, you've been in the bike industry for over 25 years now. You've studied biomechanics, sports medicine at university. Tell us a little bit about your career path before landing up at WTB a few years ago.
Sure, yeah. So, I started off in cycling as a cyclist and riding bikes and both mountain and road, and racing at a pretty high level. And this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it was, continental US type stuff. Did a lot of racing and really enjoyed it. But I have this brain that kind of thinks in physics. And so I'd see teammates riding and I'd be like, that guy's pedaling differently than the other guy's pedaling, but they're both successful. And so why is that? And what drives those differences? And so at the kind of the conclusion of my racing career, I decided, well, let's go back and study these things. And so I went back to University of Colorado and studied biomechanics and physiology. And through that process, I got a job at one of the premier sports medicine facilities in the U.S. At the time. It was Boulder Center for Sports Medicine in Boulder, Colorado. And I was running a human performance lab, and I was helping athletes of all varieties, both from the Olympic level all the way down to your everyday weekend athlete, overcome these issues. And vast majority of it was cycling, because that was my expertise and a lot of that clinic's expertise. But there was some skiers and runners and all that kind of stuff in there too. So yeah, I came through that program and really kind of dove into what makes cycling unique and what are the common problems and what do we see with a lot of riders. In a lot of it, in my vision, was geared towards the saddle. So I actually worked with, and this is now 20 plus years ago, wrote some papers on saddle widths, did some empirical kind of studies where we were looking at what does the human pelvis look like, what are the variations there. And one of the things that was very clear to me from early on was the fact that a lot of people aren't getting the right support out of a saddle. And I was seeing a whole host of issues that were coming from incorrect saddle choice, and lots of attention can be paid to incorrect saddle position, which also is a factor. You can get the right saddle in the wrong place, and that also isn't as good as it could be. So yeah, I went through this process where I was, doing all this research and working with clients and seeing thousands of we call them patients, thousands of riders a year in the sports medicine facility. And that drew some attention from some of the people in the industry. So they were saying, hey, who's this? What's going on over here? And, Boulder, Colorado has always been this hotbed of cycling. And, we've got some folks over there that are doing some good work and helping riders enjoy their ride better. So that led me to contacts in the industry, and then kind of matriculated to the point where there wasn't a whole lot more advancement for me in that particular field, and so I decided, hey, why not we switch over to the bike industry and see what we can do to help further this cause of creating happy cyclists. But do it at a product level and do it at an education level. Because that was actually my first stop was, got hired on from Specialized, first as a consultant, but then as a full-time to help run their in-house university, their in-house training facility. And so what I was doing was running, teaching dealers. And so we'd bring bike dealers into the facility and we'd teach them all kinds of stuff about product knowledge, but we'd also teach them about biomechanics. And that was my aspect. Like, how do we make riders happier? How can we make their first hop on a bike during a test ride close the deal, to essentially? How can we make that, so that they're not turned away by this uncomfortable point when it's not really the bike, it was just how it was set up for that particular rider. So we went through that, and then that grew into, helping out with the Pro Tour teams. And I worked over in Europe for 9 seasons and almost 10 years of working with World Tour riders. And again, mostly road, but some folks that were on the mountain bike. I've worked on like cross country riders and a couple downhillers, actually worked with a couple of them too. And then from there, it just kind of grew and grew. And I worked with all those riders. And then we worked, like, I've spent thousands of hours in the wind tunnel and developing all those positions and making sure that, not only they're, because you can create, an aerodynamic position that you can't pedal, right?
Yeah.
So, one of the kind of the funny thing I always like to say is, or joke about is, what's the fastest bike and rider on the planet? And it's a recumbent. But when was the last time you saw a recumbent go uphill fast? Right? You don't, right? So there's something about the marriage of, you can be super aero, but you also need to be powerful, and you need to put your engine in a place where it can actually produce the power to do what they need to do. So yeah, I worked through all of that, and then finally was, consulted with WTB, and then they were looking for somebody to help drive their saddle development and saddle programs. And so I jumped at that opportunity. It was really exciting to be able to kind of take over that whole product division. And I'd been helping with development of saddles, of course, before for 10 or 12 years. And so then getting the opportunity to kind of take the whole product management, the whole product life cycle on board. And it's just a whole new interesting thing that I can still apply all my expertise with, and then help more riders out.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. You had, you played it very low key, but you had 4 Tour de France Tour de France champions in that time. Many world champions. Like, who was the hardest person to get comfortable back in your kind of road phase?
Without a doubt, it's your countryman, Mark Cavendish.
Okay.
I worked with him for, 6 or 7 years. And he, as you probably remember or have seen in videos, he's a fidgeter and he won't stop moving. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just who he is. And that's one of the things that, when you work with not just professional athletes, but everyday athletes, you have to understand what makes them unique. And that's my whole approach with saddles and making sure that, riders are comfortable, is what makes this person unique. So in Mark's case, the challenge with him is he would change stuff just to change stuff. Not that it was better, and not that what he was on was bad. He was happy. But after a month or so, he just gets kind of nervous and is like, I'm just going to change it. And so you kind of have to lean into that and just say, okay, yeah, that's fine. And then give him an opportunity to change it and work through those changes, and then see if he comes back around. Or, like I said, he was difficult to work with, but also very, as most of those guys are, they're very precise and they can be very demanding. And some of them are very attenuated, or they're very keen on what works for them, but others aren't. And that's the interesting thing. We shouldn't judge our experience, or we shouldn't gauge our experience based on what a professional athlete can do.
Before we move on to talking about sorting us amateur riders out, you mentioned that you worked with some downhill guys in the Specialized days. I'm guessing timing-wise, that might have been Troy Brosnan and Aaron Gwynn kind of era.
Yep.
I mean, obviously, you don't spend a lot of time sat on a saddle as a downhill rider, but what are you looking at in that instance? Is it like body position on the bike or pedal efficiency? How are you dealing with those guys?
So it starts with, actually, they do a ton ton of road riding. They do a ton of road training. And, they are very, very fit athletes. To compete at that level, obviously, you've got to be, not just in the gym physically strong, because that, of course, is the case, but aerobically, they have to be really, really strong. I remember years ago, there was in the U.S., there was a group that was looking for the next track athlete for the velodrome. And where do we find like really good track riders? And they actually were testing a bunch of different cyclists, and they found that the most peak power output was coming from downhill racers. And I'm not sure who they were talking at the time, but they talked to one guy and said, well, how do you explain this? How come how can you be stronger, with more peak power than a track racer or something like that? And the rider was like, well, I get on my 50-pound downhill bike and I sprint at a 40-foot double. And if I don't make it, I'm in the hospital. So I need to be able to accelerate super fast. So they're actually seeing, some of the biggest peak powers out of downhill racers. And it, like I said, it starts from, their time on the road bike. At least my introduction was starting from their time on a road bike, because they got to put in those miles and get the cardiovascular work done. So that was where it started. And then it was, you gain some trust, you gain this person, understands my situation or the rider's situation. So then we start tweaking little things about, foot pedal interface, cranks, where those come into play. Some saddle position, depending upon the course, they will adjust ever so slightly up and down. It's not just always slammed. And they will also adjust saddle angle just a little bit, depending upon the course, how steep it is, those types of things. And again, they're not really sitting, but a lot of times they're guiding with their thighs. They're guiding their bike, the rear end of the bike around. But even things like brake lever position, right? And brake lever throw. So there's this thing in anatomy that's called a muscle tendon length relationship, where your muscles work best in a certain range, right? So if you think about like your arm fully extended, your bicep isn't very strong. And then when it's fully closed, your bicep isn't very strong. But in that middle, that's where it's really working. All your muscles have that, even into your fingers, right? So people talk about forearm pump and, finger fatigue and are they over gripping and grip diameter? Like all these things play into this concept of muscle tension length relationship, so that we're not, if you're hand and you're really reaching with your finger and you're pulling this way, that can be very fatiguing versus more in the middle of that range of motion, and also very closed, right? If you're very closed, you're also not being able to pull very strong, and of course you could bottom out the lever. So there's, working on some of those sweet spots with downhill riders can pay off.
Yeah, super interesting stuff, man. So coming back to saddles, it's something that's so focused on in the pro field, especially people that are spending a lot of time in the saddle, like XC riders, enduro riders, the road community, obviously. Why do you think they're so neglected and misunderstood by most regular riders? Because, everyone's got one on every bike in their garage, but rarely do people put much thought into them, I think.
Again, it's because the adaptability and the accommodation of the human body, right? So there are people who millimeters absolutely matter, where you can adjust their saddle height 3 millimeters, and all of a sudden they're in, if it's the wrong way, they can be in a lot of pain, right? And they could have, knee issues or something along those lines. But there's other people, I like to use another pro rider as a great example. Jens Voigt, famously finished a tour stage on a bike that was 4 sizes too small. It looked like he looked like a 6'7" tall gentleman that he is on this little itty bitty bike. But he finished a tour stage and it didn't hurt him, right? So there's this varying range of accommodation where some people are very susceptible to malalignment and others are not. And typically the pros are not, because if they did have a lot of issues, if they were really fine-tuned susceptibility, then they wouldn't make it as far as they do, right? They wouldn't necessarily get to the level that they're at. So they tend to be very adapting and tend to be very accommodating, which is, they don't also always get to choose their equipment, right? Their sponsors are saying, here's your equipment that you're riding. I think we're in a place now where we're seeing a lot more professionals being able to choose their points of contact, saddles and stuff like that are very in tune to what they need. But that kind of carries over into the everyday rider because, some people hop on a bike and it's not an issue. They don't even notice the saddle. And, I do run across this. It's interesting with talking with cycling journalists. A lot of these folks that are writing reviews, I ask them about their own personal experiences and their issues. And they're like, yeah, I never have an issue. I just throw on the saddle and I go. I'm like, well, I hope you realize that that's not necessarily indicative of all your readers, right? That lots of people do have significant issues with the saddle. It's, in fact, there's not scientific data to necessarily support it, but I would suggest that more than 50% of the female population don't ride bikes because of the saddle, and they won't talk about it. And they'll there's lots of discussion later, in my circle anyway, of anatomists and biomechanics, that women just will say, I just don't like riding a bike. When if you can actually distill down into it, a lot of them will say, oh, it's because the saddle is really bothering me and I just don't want to mention that. So I just don't like riding bikes. Okay. So that can be an issue. So there is this huge variety, like I said, the variety of tolerances, right? And some people can hop on a bike. It's also dependent upon the length of ride and how they're using their bike, right? So lots of folks aren't necessarily getting on their bike and pedaling for 3 or 4 hours, right? If they get on their bike and they're going to go ride with their kids, or if they go, around town, they go on a cruiser ride, they go, to do errands, or they go for, an hour and a half mountain bike ride, of which 45 minutes of it is pedaling uphill, and then 15 minutes of it is what they're looking for, is the fun of going downhill. They can necessarily deal with it, but awareness is the key, right? And if they realize, maybe I don't have to deal with this, maybe there's a solution, maybe there's a way I can help, that we can help more people enjoy cycling better through component selection.
What are the sort of things that might indicate I need a different saddle then? What are the kind of common issues that people tend to experience? Well,
first and primarily, obviously, is numbness, genital perineal numbness. That should not be tolerated, period. If you're going numb on your saddle and you think, oh, it's only once in a while, start shopping for a new saddle, period. There's, we can dive into the kind of the medicine behind that, or what's going on. And basically, if you are at the point where you're pressuring the pudendal nerve, which is a nerve deep, it's very deep in the crotch, basically in the pelvis, you're already cutting off things like blood flow that are important, right? So because if you think the artery's here and the nerve is here, so by the time you've actually squished through the artery to make the nerve go numb, there's already an issue. You can squish the artery, but not impact the nerve. That type of issue or damage, you say, is recoverable, right? That you feel that the next day you're fine. That's no big deal, right? And lots of times with mild numbness, it's gone the next day or in 20 minutes, and that's fine. But if we can avoid that altogether, that's the better way to do it. And
could the numbness be? Is it definitely straight away a saddle change, or could it be a change in height or angle of saddle? How do you discern the differences there?
I would start by, and yes, to answer your question, yes, you can. It definitely can be that. But honestly, it can be really connected to lots of different things. So number one, if you have your saddle too high, right, then you're going to have to reach too far at the bottom of the pedal stroke. One of the things you see quite a lot with that is, a significant amount of hip rock, where you're really having to reach with your hip to the bottom of the pedal stroke. that can manifest itself in a bunch of different ways. But number one is the saddle will feel like it's splitting you in the middle, right? Because you're having to rock up and over. And so you do get a lot more pressure, where if you can get the saddle to the right height, then you don't necessarily have that same pressure in the midline. Again, it comes from midline pressure, right? So, my stance, and I think lots of different saddle manufacturers now stance is about, let's put the pressure where it needs to be, where it can accommodate. So, the human crotch is not designed to bear weight, but we're going to sit on a bike seat. So how do we do that? We have to find a structure that accommodates to weight bearing, and that's bone, right? Our bones are meant to support our mass. Soft tissue is not. It'll never accommodate to weight bearing. So my stance, and I know that there's definitely colleagues of mine in the industry that say, let's put that weight on the bone and relieve the midline. And that's not necessarily everyone's take. There's definitely people out there that want to distribute the pressure throughout the entire region, because that means your peak pressures are less, right? Because saddles don't make you magically lighter. You still have the same mass. So where you're putting that mass is important, and you want to make sure that you can put it under a structure that can accommodate to weight bearing. So getting the right saddle with the right pressure distribution underneath your sit bones, and then getting it at the right position. And yes, you can have the saddle too high, would also cause some of that. So I would start by saying, hey, can we take your existing saddle and we can probably do a little bit of movements, make sure it's not too high, make sure it's not too far, back. Because one of the things, if it's too far back and you're going to scoot forward on it, then you're just sitting on the nose and you're not getting pressure distributed onto your sit bones. But even if that's not the right shape, then, I wouldn't waste too much time on it. I would say, 3 or 4 adjustments. And if it's still not doing the trick, let's try a different shape.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. So you've got the numbness piece, and then there's other stuff that kind of comes in with, like, I guess, the pedaling mechanics that the saddle forces you into doing, right? Which can cause, knee injuries or knee issues and all sorts of other, I guess it's like an overuse style injury, maybe. How can we think about that? Yeah.
So, cycling at 90 RPM is 5,000 times an hour, right? And so you go out for a couple hour rides, you're looking at, possibly 10,000 revolutions, and you do that a few times a week, that you can see it all adds up, right? And if you're not in a great position, your body has to accommodate to that. And some people, like I said, can accommodate easily, and some people can't. So, lots of times when you see, the saddle in the wrong position, too high or too low. Too high is, tend to see more posterior chain issues. You have hamstring tendonitis, hamstring issues. Like, it feels like your posterior legs are very tight all the time. Calf issues are very tight. Too low, you get a lot more quadricep issues, more front of the knee, tibial tendonitis, quadriceps tendonitis, those types of things. And a lot of the ballparking has been getting us close in terms of saddle height, right? We want to make sure that we get the saddle, 30 degrees or so of knee bend is measured with a goniometer, blah, blah, blah. But basically, you don't want full extension at the bottom of the pedal stroke, and you don't want to be so bent that all you're feeling is your quads. You want to be able to utilize all the muscles, both quads, hamstrings, and glutes through the whole pedaling stroke. So we see that. But now saddle choice could also be a big factor here too. So say you have the wrong width, right? And this was very common. It's a little less common now, but we're definitely seeing somewhere you have maybe one sit bone supported and the other off the side of the saddle. So the saddle's too narrow. And so you end up getting partial support. And then what happens, actually I have a pelvis here. Look at this. So
perfect.
Props. So say, just to orient yourself, this is a pelvis looking forward. And so these are the sit bones that we want to sit on, right? And we want to get those both supported. Now, if only one is supported, what happens is we fall this way. But the funny thing is because the shape of the saddle, it's almost never a lateral tilt. It's almost always a rotation, because the way the saddle shapes this flares out this way. You'll get one sit bone supported, and then one hip will come forward. What happens to your knees when you do that, right? So now you have knees that are not tracking vertically, they're tracking off to the side. And so you can get some medial or lateral knee issues. That happens quite commonly. That's based on saddle choice and making sure that we're not getting the right saddle. So shape is a big factor in comfort of a saddle.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different shapes out there, right? This isn't just a male-female thing, right? There's a lot more variation within people than just gender. Yes,
and that is also the case. Yeah, talking about gender. There's as much variation in the gender as there is between the genders, right? And we think about sit bone width. So sit bone width is what people are measuring, and that's here to here. Right? And so you're measuring this horizontal distance. The variation here is pretty massive. It's actually, so I've measured tens of thousands of people now over the course of my career. And scientifically, when I did the last paper I wrote on the study of this, the difference was between 80 millimeters and 165 millimeters.
Whoa.
It's huge.
And
it's a bell-shaped curve of averages, right? So those outliers are outliers. They're less than 1% of the population. So they still want to ride a bike. They still want to sit on a saddle, right? And so the bell-shaped curve of averages show that men are somewhere around 117 millimeters and women are somewhere around 128 millimeters. But because they're bell-shaped curves, there's so much overlap that it's kind of irrelevant. It doesn't, and in the generals, and as a rider, you don't care what the average is. You care what you are, right? It doesn't matter that the average is this. That I always like to say, the average male shoe size in Europeans is 42 and a half. Does that mean we all need to ride 42 and a half shoes? No, we ride what works for us, and apply that same logic to the saddle. We want to make sure that we get the saddle that's right for us and that's going to support our bones. But because that is a huge range, and in that last study that I had done, this was a while ago, but that last study that I'd done, both the narrowest and the widest were women. So you never know until you measure. There is zero correlation between this measurement and any external measurement. That means you can't measure your hips. You can't measure anything other than measuring your sit bones and be sure of what you're getting, because everything else is, you can't measure like outer hip width. I've seen people with really wide. I remember working with a NFL football player once, and I mean, it's huge individual. And his hips were wider than my shoulders by far, but he had extremely narrow sit bones. They were somewhere around 90 millimeters or so. So there's no correlation between, external measurements and this, but that's good news, because that means we don't have to guess. We just go and measure. We can just have a measurement done. We can do it. There's ways to do it at home. There's tons of YouTube videos on how to take a sit bone measurement. And we can get reasonably close, and then now we can then start shopping for, the appropriate width saddle.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's start working through saddle design a little bit then, and kind of ticking off some of those elements to help people understand them. So we can start with saddle shape, the width, the flexibility, the stability of the saddle. And I guess maybe is there in your mind, if you're going to do it at home, is there best in class way of measuring your sit bones at home? Which method would you recommend? I would recommend, if you want the best method of measurement, go to a shop that's got a measurement device. There's all kind of fancy ones out there now, and they're all pretty good, right? If that's not available to you, you live in an area where you can't go have that independently measured. Using a piece of corrugated cardboard on a flat, hard surface like a wooden step, and sitting and really pressing into it with your sit bones, and then when you stand up, you'll see little indentations, and then you can put little marbles in there and then measure the distance or whatever, and that'll get you reasonably close. And are you measuring center to center of those indentations?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So like the point of the sit bone, basically the center of each of the little troughs that it would make. Yeah.
Yep. And that gives you an idea of roughly, what kind of width saddle you should be looking at. Now, the goal here is to get bony structural support, like I said before. So I've got a saddle here. I'm going to...
Okay.
So we want to sit with our sit bones supported. And obviously, if one's off, that's not supported. Unfortunately, the industry has adopted an outside to outside width measurement, right? So this saddle is 142 millimeters wide, right? Mm-hmm. You can't sit on the outside to outside, right? So what's the available seating area? So when you dive a little bit deeper, it's like, well, obviously I can't put my bones way out here. So where is that for this particular saddle? And that's where, a lot of these saddles are having these fit ranges. So we've got a fit range listed up underneath on our saddles. So for the Solano here is 110 to 125 for a medium width and 125 to 155 for a wide width. So this is, if you think about just numerically, this is a 142, but it only fits to 125 measurement, right? So I do still get a lot of questions about, I'm 135 millimeters wide. I should be able to fit on a 142. Well, if we look at the saddle in this particular manner, the way it drops off, there's kind of unusable space out here. So this isn't part of the seating area where we need to be able to get seating area here. I understand it's a really hard thing doing all the CAD drawings myself. As an engineer, it's really hard to figure out what this area is, right? So that's why we're listing that out, and lots of companies are listing out what their fit ranges are. But that's the cool part about it is you don't necessarily need to go off what anybody says. You can once you have your measurement, you can take that measurement and go look at saddles and say, where does it fit? Can I get support on this particular saddle? Mm-hmm. So,
that's on the website for you guys and on the base of all the saddles, the sit bone width,
the fit range.
Fit range. Yeah.
And then shape is also, so there's width as part of a shape, right? But then these are three-dimensional objects, right? And so is the pelvis, right? So that all those things match up, and they can be different in different variations. So for instance, you have something like the Solano, which tip to tail is relatively flat compared to, our Volt saddle, which all of a sudden has a lot more curvature in through here. And those are great for different styles of riders and different demands of those particular riders. So one of the things that really influences beyond sit bone width is a great start. But now, how does this rider use the saddle and what makes them unique? Again, my goal is to find out what makes each rider unique and find a saddle that works for that uniqueness, if you will. So once we get sit bone supported, now I take a look at what's flexibility and stability of that particular rider, because those do play a role. If you have the ability, say you do a lot of yoga and you're super flexible and you're super strong and stable, then you can tilt forward with your pelvis. You can keep your spine straight. You can tip forward with your pelvis till you find the appropriate place, and then reach down and put your hands on your handlebars. So that's different from somebody who doesn't have that flexibility, who sits down on the saddle, but then to reach the handlebars, they just bend with their back, right? Mm-hmm. So this is your spine. I'm thinking this is your spine, and this is the saddle. So you're either tilting or you're bending, and that plays into their own flexibility and stability requirements or abilities there, right? So if you have good flexibility and good stability, you're going to tilt forward, and a saddle that's a little flatter gives you a little bit more freedom to do that. So you can plant your sit bones on the seating area and tilt forward, and you kind of have this freedom of movement, freedom of pelvic tilt. That's not necessarily better than the rider that can't do it. This particular rider wants a little bit more of a cradle. So they can't tilt their pelvis forward because they're tight. Their hamstrings are not allowing their pelvis to tilt. So what we want is the saddle to come up to meet them a little bit, right? And so this is more of that getting the sit bone support here and a little bit more cradle through the seating area and that gives them the stability that they're looking for. So kind of the difference is this is mechanical stability out of the saddle, and this particular rider is muscular stability. They're going to be able to hold that position on their own and feel that freedom of movement. So there's kind of two different saddle shapes beyond just width. There's a few more than that, but looking at those kind of, those are kind of the key ways that people can start distilling down and saying, okay, do I have good flexibility and stability? Maybe I'd like a saddle that's a little flatter in profile, still get those sit bone supports, give me a little pelvic freedom that I can tilt my pelvis back and forth. Or maybe I don't, and people are generally pretty honest whether they're flexible or not, and if they don't, then hey, we can get you supported in a saddle that's got a little bit more of that cradling shape that can help support that rider.
Is that the sort of thing you could diagnose, like if you went riding with a friend, and I guess like if you're on a steepish climb where you're really leaning forward, and get your friend to look at and say, like, am I tipping at the hip here, or am I flexing my back to do this? Is that visually something that can be picked up on, or is it about just being honest with yourself and how you feel about your level of flexibility?
Well, no, you can definitely have somebody do that. It's actually better done not necessarily on a bike, because when you're on a bike, especially up a steep climb, there's other things that are playing into it, right? So you're trying to keep the front wheel down. If you do scooch on the nose, now you're not going to, which sometimes we do. If the climb's really steep, we're going to scooch on the nose for a short period of time, but that's not going to allow us to tilt forward, because all of a sudden we're sitting on our perineum, and we don't like to do that, right? So we tend to crunch and all the muscles in our pelvic floor are contracted to give us something to sit on, which doesn't allow us to tilt our pelvis. So the easiest way is to have a buddy, or you could maybe do it with a mirror, stand with locked out legs and just forward fold. Okay. And one of the things that we're really looking for is the angle of your pelvis. So not how your back is bent, but if you can look at the sacrum, which is this part of your pelvis. So if you can look at the sacrum, and that person, when they go to, I hate to say touch their toes, because people are competitive. You say touch your toes, they're going to touch their toes no matter what. But forward fold, bend at the waist and try and tilt your pelvis as far as you can, and where your hands are is where they end up. But if you end up with your sacrum really not necessarily parallel to the ground, but really close to parallel to the ground, that means your hamstrings are flexible enough to allow that to happen. If that person goes to forward flex and they get just a little bit, and all of a sudden the pelvis doesn't move, and now all that, they're still going, they're still reaching. So that's the spine flexing to get down to the thorax. So it's a little easier just to do it off the bike than it is on the bike. Okay. But you see it all the time. You see people riding, and they could be, world tour pros that are super strong, but their back is super arched, and they just don't have the flexibility. It's not a bad or good thing. It's just who they are. It's what makes them unique.
Okay, that makes total sense. So we've got the shape of the saddle, both width and the kind of 3D element of things. And then we've got different padding options, right? Like there's thick saddles, thin saddles. Is thicker better? I'm assuming it's more complex than that.
It is more complex than that. So thick isn't always better, and thick isn't always worse, right? So what I like to do is to dive into what makes them unique in terms of, are they on their bike for a long period of time? How are they using their bike? Are they seated, grinding out? And effort level plays into this too, right? So if we're riding hard, physics says every force is an equal and opposite force. So if we're pushing down, there's a reactionary force that's pushing back up. People wonder maybe why road cyclists in particular, but racing cyclists don't use very thick padded saddles. Reality is they're not sitting on the saddle very hard. Like I've pressure mapped thousands of them. There's not a lot of downward force of them sitting on the saddle because there's so much downward force on the pedals. Mm-hmm. So if you're pedaling hard, you actually don't need as much padding than you do when you're pedaling easy. When you're pedaling easy, you're planted a little bit harder in the saddle. you could use a little bit more cushion. The hardest, the most difficult or the worst, most intense saddle pressures that we ever really see are on easy trainer rides, right? So the bike is just immobile underneath you and you're not pedaling very hard, and a comfortable saddle all of a sudden does not feel comfortable anymore because you're just sitting so heavy into it. So, that mobileness of the bike moving underneath you and the forces generated by you pushing down and it elevating you off can mean you need a little bit less padding if your typical ride is kind of this short, intense ride, right? So if somebody says, hey, I go out and my typical ride is 1 hour. That's all the time I have. So I go out and I just drill it, and I just chase down my buddies and I sprint up these hills. And that's what I'm looking for. Then yeah, I'm going to steer them towards maybe a not as thicker padded option. But if that rider says, hey, I'm a I pedal at moderate intensities. Sometimes, mountain biking terrain makes you go hard all the time, right? There's no easy rides up a hill. Like if you're fitter, you just go faster. They still hurt. So, what, I'd like to do with them is they say, okay, you're riding, a little bit longer rides or maybe not as intensely. You're not chasing your friends. So we'll use kind of more that middle thickness of padding. And if somebody likes to do really long rides or, they're really easy rides, then maybe towards that really thicker level of padding. And where that plays into, say, in a not necessarily the best way, because if that was the case, then everyone would have these big squishy saddles, right? But the big squishy saddle still needs to be supportive and it still can't get in the way. And so a lot of the big cruiser bike seats, the city bike seats that are big and thick and padded, they're fine on a really short, easy ride. And if your goal is to ride around the neighborhood with your kids, absolutely get one of those big, thick padded saddles. But if your goal is to pedal up a hill, all of a sudden you're going to find that big saddle in the way and it's not allowing your legs to move. And there's too much around your sit bones. So that's having too wide of a saddle. And I guess we didn't go back to sit bone width. Too wide of a saddle is just as bad as too narrow of a saddle, right? Because if you've got too much saddle around where your sit bones are, then your legs aren't working. So your sit bones are the attachment points for your hamstrings. So that's where your hamstrings come up and attach, is your ischial tuberosities. So we want to make sure that there's some freedom of movement for your legs to work and to pedal, but not so much that it's in the way of your pedaling, right?
Okay,
so
that makes sense. Yeah.
So different paddling thicknesses can play into different riders' desires. And sometimes, we might have a saddle that is, great for our one experience. And so maybe we like to go on long mountain bike rides, and spend the weekends and do 3 to 4 hours on the mountain bike. But during the week, we're doing 45 minutes on the road bike in town, right? And so that could be a different saddle, that could be a different way to look at it. I would caution though that, because saddles are so tricky, and if you are a person that is challenged by saddle selection, if you find a saddle that works, stick with that saddle first off, right? Yes, there are reasons that you could use a different saddle on a different bike and a different experience. But again, if you're sensitive to saddle issues, and you found one that works, stay with that first.
That's good advice.
Yeah.
What about on the e-bike side of things? Because I hadn't really thought about it until recently, and I've got the Rocket e-bike saddle that you guys make, and it is really comfortable, and also has that little kind of hidden handle underneath, which is helpful for lifting the bike. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I guess on an e-bike, like you're not pedaling as hard. You're spending more time sat down because you've got the power of the bike. Hence why that, I guess, is a more thickly padded saddle. Is that fair?
That is fair. That is, in development of the Rocket, we did a lot of surveying and a lot of research, market research. We were out there and talking to e-bikers and seeing how they're using the saddle. And there was a couple of really interesting things that came out of that, and seeing the people riding e-bikes and being on them and knowing how it's kind of interesting because, those of us that ride a lot before e-bikes and then do ride e-bikes now, we still pedal our e-bikes like an analog bike, right? We still have the right gear, the right saddle height, choosing the right gear to be in. There's so many times I'm out there riding and I see people that are new to cycling that are just jump right into an e-bike, which is great. I'm glad that opportunity exists for them to get out there, but they don't have, like, they're in the biggest gear possible, right? And they're just, they're turning a cadence of like 15 and the motor's doing all the work, which is okay. But, we also know in physics is physics, our vehicles, our cars, if we're trying to go up a hill and the engine RPM is only at 1200, it's struggling. And that's the same thing with this engine, right? So I was like, hey, downshift, get on top of that gear, get the saddle at the right position. Because a lot of times I've seen people, again, same style of folk, that they don't even raise their saddle to go uphill. They're in too big a gear and their saddle's all the way down and they're just, and I'm like, well, you could probably save, 20% of your engine life or your battery life by having it run more efficiently. And so, yeah, that was a little bit of a digression, but for saddle wise, that rider is seated a little bit more, and they're actually seated more in situations where the analog bike is not seated, right? So when we get really steep climbs, they'll actually stay seated and push into the saddle a little bit more, scoot up maybe a little bit, but mostly just push in the saddle and let the motor contribute those extra watts. Whereas an analog rider would have to stand up to get those extra watts. Yeah, they're going to move a little bit more forward on the bike, get their center of gravity a little bit more forward. But yeah, so that actually, the other feature that helps with that in the Rocket is called the backstop. So deep in the foam, I built a kind of a rise to it towards the tail of the saddle. And what that allows you to do is on those steep climbs, you kind of sit into that and it gives you a little bit of something to push against. But the challenge was to not have a big external kick up, because that'll also do it. If you have a saddle with a big external kick up, that'll also do it. But now all of a sudden that's in the way when you're trying to descend, right? So you want mobility off the saddle and don't want to catch that big kick up. So what we did with the backstop was we buried it in the foam. And so there's a curvature up that's inside the foam that gives you support for when you're climbing those super steep hills. And yeah, having a little bit more padding helps with this particular rider. Because they are seated for so much longer and they aren't necessarily pedaling as hard. Yes, they're still pedaling hard at times, but the motor's supplying so much more extra watts to them as they're not having to hit the same kind of peak powers that an analog rider is.
Yeah, it makes sense. It is a super comfy saddle on the e-bike. Let's talk about cutouts, right? Because we see that in a lot of saddles, like either a relieved area, I guess, or a full hole in the saddle. What's the thought process behind that, and what should we be looking for to try and match that up to our specific kind of needs? Yep.
So cutouts are very useful in relieving perineal pressure, right? If there's no saddle there, there's no pressure. There can't be pressure. But widths of cutouts and shapes of cutouts do make a huge difference, especially for female cyclists. So we want to make sure that we've got enough cutout to help support them. Now, does it need to be a full cutout versus just a channel? And the answer is, doesn't need to be a full cutout. You can get a substantial amount of pressure relief out of a channel, provided the channel is deep enough, wide enough, and the foam around it is stiff enough, right? So if you have, this particular saddle, if you can see, it's not a very deep channel. However, it doesn't need to be a very deep channel because the base is pretty stiff. It doesn't flex a lot, and the foam is comfortable, but it's not super squishy, so you don't blow through the foam, right? It's supportive. It gives you this rebound quality where you compress it to a certain point, and then it's like progressiveness of your suspension. The softness, the first bit is soft, and then it firms up and firms up. And so that allows you to never bottom out. Whereas, a saddle that's more designed around that squish experience, the cutout becomes a little bit washed out as the rider sits and mashes all that foam down. So in that regard, you don't necessarily have to have a cutout to relieve perineal pressure, but you need to balance that out with proper foam density, proper base construction too, because the hard shell on the bottom, this is what's providing the stability. So the shape and everything that's coming out of the base of the saddle, the shell of the saddle, that's where your support's coming from. And then the padding is just that. It's padding on top of that foundation, right? So we want to make sure that the padding also, and there's padding options out there too, right? So lots of companies aren't necessarily discussing this, but there are varying levels of foams that are being used. And now there's 3D printing, and we can talk about that in a minute for sure. But there's different levels of PU foam. So there's polyurethane foam, there's EVA foams, there's ETPU foams. There's all these different materials of types of foams that have different qualities. And for us with the WTB, we start at a pretty high level. Our DNA-X level of padding is a very light PU. So it's, I would say it starts in the middle ground. That's where we start. And then we go up from there. And so, then we've got, we move up to our DNA, which is our super light PU, and we've got our HLX, which is more of a memory foam. And we use these foams in appropriate conjunctions with the saddle designs, right? So if we've got, the Solano, which is, a lightweight, thinner padding saddle, we're going to use more of that supportive DNA, which is an EVA type foam, our DNA foam, which has this great rebound characteristic. It doesn't need to be super thick because of the way that progressiveness of the foam works. Whereas, the HLX, which is, more of a memory foam type of issue, this rider is looking for that, stays seated a little bit longer. They're looking for more that cushiony experience versus that hard pedaling platform. And so that's where we use the HLX, which is more of that memory foam. It's got that set where you sit into that memory foam, and it gives a little bit, and then it gives that kind of set pocket that we can create. So all those foams can matter, and you can dive into, certainly on our website and all our product, we talk about what style of foam we're using in each particular saddle and why. So I think that's worth also looking at.
Okay. Maybe something that I guess a good reputable saddle manufacturer should be choosing the right foam for the product. So maybe something we shouldn't use too much sleep over, but yeah. Yeah,
they generally do, but it's also how deep in the weeds do you want to get, right? So the average rider looking at a saddle, they're not really that concerned about it, right? So as long as we as product managers are doing our job to make sure that it's got the appropriate spec foam for that rider's usage, then I think we're, basically going to be happy riders.
Yeah. What about rail material options? So I've always sort of seen that as a weight versus price thing. Like if you're happy to pay for carbon, then great, and you're going to save some weight. Is there any more to it than that from like a performance perspective? There's
a little bit. It's subtle. First off, steel. If you're looking for strength, go with steel. Period. We're testing all of our saddles at above ISO testing requirements. We're not doing full destructive testing, but we're definitely testing above ISO tests. And when we test above, the steel rail saddles always pass. It's the other saddles that may not test above the required. Now they all pass the required testing. So when somebody says, I had this rail break, I'm like, well, occasionally you do get a peak load that might be higher than what's tested, but in general, they all pass the industry standard testing. So that being said, steel rails are a little bit stronger. They're also a little heavier for sure. Mm-hmm. And then as we go up to chromoly, which is our next tier up, they get a little bit lighter, but about the same strength as steel. Then when we start to see things drop off in terms of strength, I would say, stainless is still pretty strong. Titanium, if any of the rails are going to fail under that really high level of testing, it's usually titanium. Titanium is, a fairly brittle material, so that's a difficult one. But the cool part about titanium, this is the opposite, everything has a good and a bad, is there's actually some flex in the titanium. So you actually get a little bit more suspension. So you've got, this rail over the length will give a little bit. And in addition to maybe the base, depending upon which base, there's a little bit of give to the base as well. One of the things that I do in terms of empirical testing is I'm testing all these components when I'm designing new saddles. When I get a new saddle, constructed complete, I'll go through and I'll do flex testing, and I'm able to test, where is the flex coming from, and I'll put a certain load on the particular saddle in a jig, and it'll squish the whole thing down, and I'll measure which components are flexing as to which amount. So, we've got pad compression, we've got the base shell flexes, we've got rail flexing, and I can tease all these out and I can see, oh yeah, there's a little bit more compliancy out of a titanium rail than of the other rails, right? So we get a little bit more of that compliancy. The other end of the spectrum is carbon. We don't get any compliancy out of carbon, nor do we want any compliancy out of carbon, right? So yes, we're making a very light material there, and we're going at it predominantly for weight. But what does carbon fiber also do is vibration dampening. When you have a woven construction, vibrations can't go through it. Admittedly, it's a small component. And if you were looking at, what is that doing compared to a full frame of carbon fiber is probably, insignificant, because the frame of carbon fiber is doing way more vibration damping than the saddle rails. But that is there. It can actually do that. So looking at rail materials, I think if strength is your goal, you don't want it to break, steel or chromoly is great. And then if you want a little bit more ride feel, a little bit more compliancy, and then also pretty darn lightweight, titanium's the way to go. And then if you just want, the luxury of the lightest thing that's out there, then carbon fiber rails. Carbon fiber rails in a mountain biking situation is tricky. And when we do see failures, that's typically, what we've seen with carbon fibers, because, the G-outs when you're pedaling, so you're pedaling up a hill and the trail goes down and up real quick. And so all of a sudden, it can only be, 18 inches deep, but that little divot, if you're seated, there's a huge loading of the saddle when you kind of do that down and up. And that's where we see carbon rails tend to snap, is in that kind of peak loading G-out of a mountain bike situation. You're never going to run into that situation on the road or gravel or those types of situations there. So, I personally would say, steer towards, if you want lightweight in a mountain bike situation, steer you towards titanium, because it's going to be a little bit more durable in those types of situations.
Okay, good stuff. So I think we've gone through the variables. So just to kind of shake down, if you were gonna, let's use the WTB range, obviously, because that's what you're familiar with, and you've involved heavily in the design of all of these products. First thing, I guess, is measure your sit bone width, and we've talked about a way to do that. If you can find a professional to do it, great. If you can't, then the corrugated cardboard method. So that gives you, kind of narrows things down a little bit. And then I guess the next step is to think about your level of flexibility and what shape that might require you needing. And then beyond that, I guess it's an honesty around, right, what sort of riding am I doing? What do most of my bike rides look like? And based on that, do I want something more padded, less padded? And that I guess those three things will help you narrow down pretty well within the WTB range. Is that fair?
Yeah, that definitely helps. That'll get us, no online or your remote way of doing this is 100% accurate, right? Like, I'm hoping to steer 80% of people towards 80% of the way there, right? Yeah. If you're really particular and really want to be precise, there's no substitute for getting professional help on this, right? And working one-on-one with somebody who works with dozens of saddle shapes every day, that's valuable. If you're really struggling with an issue, go find some help. Locally, there's plenty of fitters around. I've taught thousands of fitters over the career, like how to look at different saddles. And so they're out there. My goal from a product perspective and from a company perspective is if we can get people started in the right direction, because there's so many people that aren't even in there. They're not even looking in the right way to go about it. So, Yeah, if we can start off by looking at saddle width is crucial, saddle shape, and shape is derived from flexibility and stability, and then the intended use. How are you riding your bike? Are you, duration and intensity? Are you riding for long, easy rides? Are you riding for long, hard rides, short, hard rides? How all that plays into it.
Okay, fair play. Good stuff. And then finally, do saddles wear? Is it an item that, okay, this saddle was great and comfortable 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? It doesn't seem to be anymore. Should you be looking like you should replace your helmet every 3 years or so? Should you also be looking at when to replace your saddle?
Absolutely. Especially with mountain bikers, we see a lot of really old, worn out saddles there. And, first, some of the obvious signs are abrasions on the cover, right? So, with these cover materials, we've got nice microfiber and we've got these abrasion resistant corners because, hey, you lay your bike down, it scuffs and that kind of stuff. And I see these peeled up and ripped up all the time. So we've got, saddle covers coming off. But where saddle wear really comes into play is in the base itself. So we've got a couple of different materials in the bases, and almost all the saddles that we sell that are on manufacturers or OEM bikes, right? So, Pivots and Yetis and Santa Cruz, they come with our saddles on them. They're using a polypropylene base. So, a base that's got much more flexibility than a nylon glass fiber base, right? So these bases for their fusion form saddles, which is a construction method that we're using, they have not necessarily, I can tune the flex to depending upon which the rider wants, that particular rider. So we can change the makeup of the nylon and the glass fibers that are infused into here to create the flex that we want. Whereas the polypropylene, it's just polypropylene. It's just a plastic injected mold. And what happens with these over time, all that flex, because we're still flexing the base as we step into it, as we sit onto it, the whole saddle flexes in. Some people will talk about creaky rails, right? And this is part of it, is that the polypropylene flexes, and over time it just flexes more and more and more and more and more. And I've seen this saddle, 5-6 years old from people that ride a lot, that looks like an old sway-backed horse, where the whole middle is just sagged right down and right back up because the fatigue of the material, right? And so that absolutely needs to be replaced to get the same kind of feeling, right? People are like, oh, I've so worn into it. This is true, but it doesn't stop. Your shoes, you can break in a new pair of sneakers, but they don't stop breaking in. They just keep going and going and going. And then, 6-8 months later, now they're totally clapped out. Same thing happens with the saddle. It's a little bit longer than that, but I would say, if you've had your saddle 3 to 5 years and haven't crashed and ripped it up, take a look at it compared to a new one. If you're into the shop and just kind of eyeball, because that's where you'll see that flex will really make this concave right through the top. Okay. So, and that's obviously, that's moving quite a bit. The tips of the rails are moving back and forth. And that's where we get the rail creak, is possibly the saddle is worn out. And so now it's flexing too much and the rails are moving in the socket too much and causing that creak.
Okay. So another good indication that you might want a new saddle.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Before we wrap up then, Sean, what's the future of saddle design hold for us? I mean, you mentioned 3D printing, which is obviously a huge enabler for a lot of businesses. What do you see happening in the future?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, with the supply chain issues and at the state of the cycling world right now, like, development is tough to do, right? There's not a lot of money to dive into research and development. I think 3D printing is super cool. I don't know if it's the future, because I don't think they'll ever get the economy of scale needed.
Yeah,
right.
The volume side.
Always going to be expensive. Is it? Now, we've seen some good offerings from companies that are down towards more reasonable, $175 US, $200 US, but not 50. Right. Yeah. And that's that's the tough part. We sell 1 million of these or so a year. There's a huge need for that. And I think, the 3D printing is great, but I don't know if we're ever going to see the volumes because it's just so expensive. It's so expensive to make. And we're the cycling industry, right? We're not automotive. We're not, making tens of millions of these products to get the economy of scale down. So I think that's not necessarily the future in a widespread thing. I think it's really cool because it allows you to tailor some zones and change. Foam as a property in terms of the padding is consistent throughout the entire saddle, right? It's the same foam throughout the entire saddle. You can kind of do some dual density stuff, but it doesn't really pan out all that well when you do it. Whereas the 3D printing, you can really tailor the zones so you can get support where you want it and get softness where you want it. And so I think that's really cool. That's a really cool concept of being able to do that. And there's some people that are actually doing like a custom version of this, right? So that's the beauty of 3D printing, is that you don't have to make everyone the same. But again, we're not talking of economies of scale. We're talking, how many can you do of those in a year? A couple thousand at best, right? So that doesn't really solve the issues for a lot of riders. So, where I'd love to see that is some different materials selections, different diving into some different materials. And, I think that would be useful. And then really coupling, for us is going to be, as you mentioned, website developments and stuff like that, where we're trying to reach more riders. Part of, coming on the podcast. Thanks for having us, is that we want to be able to reach more riders and really drive more education as to what makes saddles comfortable and how to go about choosing them the right way.
Nice. I've definitely learned a lot in the last hour, Sean. So thanks for that. If people want to go and head to the website and have a little look at products and play with the Fit Finder and do a bit of research for themselves, like what's the website address?
WTB.com.
Easy. 3letters.com. We can handle that. I'll stick a link to that in the show notes. People can find it. But yeah, thanks for your time, man. It's been super interesting. And I look forward to seeing what's coming next in the world of saddles from you guys.
Good. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.